know a little bit about what the Oslo process is and how it came about?
The Oslo Process was something initiated in Oslo, Norway in February of 2007, and it was basically a meeting of almost 50 governments who came together to talk about what to do about cluster bombs. They came together at that point because earlier in mid-2006, Israel had dropped almost 4.6 million cluster bombers on Lebanon, and it created a huge humanitarian problem, civilian deaths, etc. And that kind of catastrophe came hot on the heels of US use of cluster munitions in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Kosovo, in Serbia, and the governments felt like they weren't able to do enough to tackle it through the conventional diplomatic means at the United Nations and in other ways. So the Norwegian foreign minister said, all right, if you're serious about wanting to do something about cluster bombs, come to Oslo and let's talk about what we can do. So the outcome of that was what they called the Oslo Declaration, and I think 46 governments signed up to that, and that committed them to go out and create a treaty to prohibit cluster munitions that pose unacceptable harm to civilians, and also it has some humanitarian measures in there to clean up the mess from cluster bombs to help the people who've been hurt by the weapon. So that's the Oslo Process that was initiated in 2007.
Brilliant. And what is New Zealand doing to support the global drive to ban cluster munitions?
New Zealand was at the meeting in February '07, and our ambassador in Geneva, Don Mackay, had negotiated the Disability Rights Convention in 2006, and he took a particular interest in this initiative to deal with cluster bombs, I think because of that experience. And so he talked to the Norwegians and to the other countries who were really deeply engaged in this, and they formed what they call a core group of about 6, 7 governments who really are steering this process and making sure that they conclude the treaty to prohibit cluster bombs. That's what the government of New Zealand is doing. But it's also important what the civil society, what the non-governmental organisations are doing. My organisation, Oxfam New Zealand, got together with some of the other local NGOs in Wellington after we heard about the launch of the Oslo Process in March last year, and we established what we called the Aotearoa New Zealand Cluster Munition Coalition. And that, I understand, was the first domestic cluster munition campaign that was launched globally. There's a lot of major international NGOs involved in the movement, but at that national level, it hadn't really been that organized until we launched at the beginning of 2007. One of our the real launch of the campaign came later in the year, in November, when we invited an Australian photographer to come out here and do a speaking tour and also talk to media, talk to politicians, talk to anybody who would listen about the problems posed by cluster bombs, and he did it with great conviction. So John Rodstick came out here and he really created the base of understanding for everybody about the humanitarian problems posed by this weapon, and by bringing him out here in November, it provided us with a really good lead-in to the really major action which happened, which was in February 2008 with the Wellington Conference.
And what role does the Wellington Conference play in the overall process?
The Wellington Conference on Cluster Munitions, which opened on the 18th of February and ran for that whole week, it was the 4th global meeting in this, what they're calling now the Oslo Process, to tackle cluster munitions. It came after meetings in Europe and in Latin America. So it was a global diplomatic conference, and it was important for 2 reasons. One, to build the support of countries who endorse the objective of dealing with cluster munitions and doing it in a very strong way. So it built support, and it also was the venue for governments really to get down to the nitty-gritty and talk about the substance and the detail of what would be in that draft agreement to tackle cluster bombs. It wasn't negotiation, that comes later. It was basically setting it up for the negotiation.
Great. And who actually attended the conference?
There was 122 governments registered to come. Ultimately, only 106 came. That was because of New Zealand's location. It's difficult to get to, and especially in February, which is the kind of peak month for travel globally, because it's summer. But 106 governments coming to New Zealand still meant that it was the biggest disarmament conference that New Zealand's ever convened, and one of the biggest multilateral gatherings of governments. And they all crowded into the Wellington Town Hall to hold their diplomatic meeting. the Aotearoa New Zealand Cluster Munition Coalition, we took care of the civil society contingent to the conference, and that meant bringing about 140 NGOs from 43 countries to the conference. And that was not an easy undertaking either, but we were really pleased with the presence, both on the government side and the non-government side. You had the kind of the Europeans participating, countries from Africa, from Latin America, but for the first time there was very strong participation from the Pacific. 9 Pacific governments came to Wellington, and we also, broadened the campaign by bringing out disability activists and small arms campaigners from countries like Papua New Guinea and Fiji and Vanuatu, and they played a really important role.
And what were the key issues that were being debated at the Wellington Conference?
They went into a series of what they call plenary, where everybody's in the main room together, and breakout sessions where small groups of diplomats get together and discuss specific aspects of the treaty. And the kind of key difference with typical UN meetings is that the NGOs, civil society, was in the room at all of those points. So we heard all of the proposals that were made. And there were several proposals made to amend the treaty text. And they kind of came under 3 key issues. The first one was governments were seeking to exempt certain types of cluster munitions from the draft treaty text, and they basically were trying to make the case that these cluster munitions are not the ones that are creating all the civilian casualties and creating that harm. It just so happened that those cluster munitions most often were the ones that they held in their arsenals, in their inventories. So it was a little bit of self-interest there. Another kind of big issue discussed was some governments wanted to delay when the treaty would actually take effect by as much as 10 years. And in that period, before the treaty would become a legal, legally binding instrument, they wanted the right to use cluster munitions. And it doesn't really make sense if you're out there, seeking to ban the weapon, but hold on, let me use it for a few more years. We didn't really buy that from the campaign side. And the third issue that was really discussed was a few governments wanted to delete or weaken a provision in the draft text that prohibits countries from assisting a country that hasn't joined the treaty in the use or transfer of cluster munitions. And that country, everybody knows, is the United States, which was not at the conference and which has been one of the biggest users of cluster munitions. So some friends of the United States, such as Japan and others, tried to prohibit the assist language. So that was difficult. The most objectionable proposers for those exemptions that I just described came from 4 countries, from France, from Germany, from Japan, and from Switzerland. And they had the support of a few other governments along the way, such as Australia, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Sweden, Spain. And these are all quite powerful countries, many of which have produced and many of which stockpile cluster munitions. But the main thing is that they also understand the humanitarian impact of the weapon, and they're participating in this process to get rid of it. So it was really actually kind of positive that they got to put their issues out there on the table, and there was a really robust debate on it. But ultimately, the proposals were not inserted into the text to amend it. And that was for several reasons. Instead, the proposals were rolled into what Don Mackay called a compendium of issues. And that kind of compendium is going to inform the discussions when the treaty is actually negotiated, but it doesn't carry the same weight as the draft treaty text. Another important thing that happened when all of these proposals were being made to weaken the treaty is that the voice of the affected countries and the voice of the developing countries who support the affected countries became stronger and stronger over the course of the week when they saw what was happening, and they started to speak out. So, countries like Cambodia and Indonesia, but also the little tiny Pacific Island nation states were also speaking out, and quite forcefully, for a clear and unequivocal prohibition agreement. They weren't buying what these countries were trying to propose. So that's what happened in Wellington, and it all kind of set it up for when the treaty is negotiated in Dublin in May. I guess the kind of other major thing that was discussed in Wellington, but it wasn't agreed on because it will be agreed when the negotiations open, were the rules of procedure for those negotiations, how the governments are going to take their decisions. And as they're written up right now, it's going to take 2/3 of the countries who participate in the negotiations. It's going to require that many countries if any country wants to amend the treaty text. So that's why Africa is important, Latin America is important, the Pacific is important, the Asian countries who are participating, the affected countries, because it really was a small minority of powerful governments. They called themselves the like-mindeds, the Frances and the Germanys and the UKs, that were seeking to amend the treaty in this way. But if the majority doesn't go along with it, then we're going to, come out of this with a very strong treaty agreement.